What if the only thing keeping your plane in the air was a 2-inch piece of metal nobody had checked in years, 31,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean? A jet flying upside down, not by choice, because the two men in that cockpit had run out of every other option. Inverted flight was the only thing keeping the nose from dropping straight into the water below them. Listen to that for a second. 2 pilots, no warning, no storm, no bomb. Just a machine that stopped listening to them. This is Alaska Airlines Flight 261. And what caused it? It wasn't some rare, freak, impossible to predict failure. It was grease. Or rather, the absence of it. A part so small, so routine, that greasing it properly took less time than your lunch break. Somewhere along the way, that job stopped being worth the time it took. 88 people paid for that decision. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how that happened, and you'll understand why the fix sat unused for over a decade before anyone was finally forced to build it in. Let's go back to the beginning. January 31st, 2000. Flight 261 leaves Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, heading for San Francisco, then on to Seattle. Nothing unusual. The climb is smooth. Passengers settle in. Up front, Captain Ted Thompson and First Officer Bill Pansky are flying a routine leg they've flown 100 times before. Then, passing through 23,000 feet, something in the tail simply stops responding. The horizontal stabilizer, the part of the tail that decides whether the nose points up or down, locks in place. The autopilot disconnects on its own. The crew feels the aircraft trying to pitch, and nothing they do through the normal controls is fixing it. Now here's why that one part failing was enough to bring down an entire airliner. Every commercial jet needs a way to stay balanced as fuel burns and weight shifts mid-flight. That's the job of the horizontal stabilizer trim system. Instead of pilots wrestling the controls by hand for hours, a motor-driven screw, called a jack screw, tilts the entire tail surface in tiny increments, keeping the aircraft level without constant manual effort. This isn't a backup system. It's not optional. It's one of the primary things keeping the airplane balanced in the sky. On this aircraft, that entire job rested on a single jack screw, threaded through a single surrounding nut. For it to move safely, that nut needed to stay properly greased. Without lubrication, metal grinds against metal, and the threads holding the whole system together slowly wear away. Investigators would later pull that exact jack screw out of the wreckage, and what they found should never have been possible on a passenger aircraft. Almost no usable grease left, just a few dried, crusted traces sitting outside the area where the moving parts actually made contact. The threads inside the nut hadn't just worn down. In places, they were ground away completely. So how does something like that happen? Not overnight, not in one bad flight. This took years. Through the late 80s and into the 90s, the airline had quietly pushed back how often this part needed greasing and inspection. What once required attention every 500 flight hours eventually stretched to roughly every 2,500. Each extension got signed off by federal regulators. On paper, defensible. In practice, far fewer chances to catch a problem before it turned catastrophic. And then came the final piece. The last time this exact jack screw was greased, months before the crash, the job that should have taken around 4 hours was finished in about 1. Investigators couldn't prove that single rush job alone caused the failure. The wear was already too severe for that. What it told them instead was worse. This wasn't one mechanic having a bad day. It was a pattern. A critical safety task, quietly treated like paperwork instead of the one thing standing between a working airplane and a broken one. Back in the cockpit, none of that history mattered. All that mattered was an airplane that had suddenly stopped behaving normally. Thompson and Tansky ran their checklists. They radioed that they had a jammed stabilizer and that they intended to divert and land. For a moment, it looked like they'd found a way to manage it. Then, the jack screw, already stripped down to almost nothing, gave way completely. With the threads gone, the tail surface was no longer held in a controlled position. Aerodynamic forces slammed it into an extreme angle, and the aircraft pitched violently downward. The crew fought it with everything they had, and at one point, in a decision still studied in aviation circles today, they intentionally rolled the aircraft upside down, using gravity and airflow in a way no manual ever taught them, buying themselves one brief window of level flight. It wasn't enough. The aircraft went down into the Pacific Ocean, a few miles off the California coast. All 88 people on board were killed. In the aftermath, investigators didn't just ask what failed, they asked something more uncomfortable. Why was the system ever allowed to depend on one single part, with no backup in the first place? And that question is the part of this story that actually changed something. The nut on this aircraft had two separate sets of threads doing the same job, which sounds like redundancy, right? But both sets shared the exact same maintenance schedule, the exact same lubrication, the exact same blind spot. If one set was quietly wearing away undetected, the other almost certainly was too. There was no independent backup, no secondary system designed to catch the aircraft if this one point failed. A single part, worn down over years of stretched out maintenance intervals, was allowed to be the only thing keeping the tail under control. That's the gap this accident exposed. Not just a maintenance failure, a design that never planned for what happens when the one part everything depends on simply runs out of margin. In the years after this crash, regulators pushed through some of the most significant changes to jack screw inspection rules in aviation history. Tighter intervals, tougher wear checks, and a hard requirement that airlines prove, with real data, that any extension to a maintenance schedule is actually safe, not just ask for one and hope it gets approved. None of that helped the 88 people on Flight 261. But it's the reason similar aircraft flying today are inspected in ways that would have caught this exact failure years before it turned fatal. Sometimes the parts that never make it into the safety briefing are the ones 100 lives are quietly resting on.